Welcome to Mr. Fyra. Please like this video and subscribe this channel. Now let's start. After 12 years of running the family business, my parents kicked me out and made my 22-year-old nephew the CEO because he is smart like his mother. Now, after he destroyed the company, they are begging for my help. Hey everyone, we spend so much time finding these stories for you. If you enjoy the content, please hit that subscribe button. It means the world and helps keep this journey going strong. Let's grow together. Now let's start the video. OP starts by saying, "Hey Reddit, I've always thought of myself as a guy who's got his life together, but lately, I'm starting to question everything. Let me set the scene for you all. This all started at my dad's 62nd birthday party, and I swear it felt like my life flipped upside down in an instant. For context, I've been working in my dad's company for the past 12 years. 12 years of dedication, grinding, and building up the business. I thought I was set. I thought I'd inherit the company one day, as any loyal family member might expect after putting in the work. It was a pretty big party, honestly. We had friends, family, business associates, you name it. My mom and dad love a good celebration, and this one was no exception. Drinks were flowing, the food was amazing, and everyone seemed to be having a good time. Then came the moment my dad stood up to make a toast. I thought it would just be the usual, a couple of jokes, a heartfelt thank you, and maybe a little bit about how much he was looking forward to retiring. But then he hit us with that announcement. I'm happy to say that after much thought and discussion, I'm ready to retire in a few months, and I've decided to pass the torch of CEO to someone who I think will take the company to new heights. My grandson, Mike." I froze. I thought maybe I'd misheard him. Grandson Mike? The kid's 22, fresh out of business school with no real experience, and yet somehow, he's the one taking over the company I've dedicated over a decade of my life to. The applause and congratulations around the room felt like daggers. My heart was pounding, and my stomach felt like it was going to drop out of my body. I tried to keep my composure, but inside I was fuming. Don't get me wrong, I didn't hate Mike. He's a decent enough kid when you're just chatting with him at family get-togethers. But he's young and inexperienced. He doesn't know the first thing about running a company. And I can say that with confidence because I've been running it for years now. All Mike has is a shiny degree and my parents' misplaced confidence. I, on the other hand, had years of blood, sweat, and tears invested into this business. But apparently, that didn't count for much. After the toast, everyone went back to mingling, but I couldn't even process what was happening. My wife came over to check on me, and I must have looked like I'd seen a ghost because she immediately asked what was wrong. I just shook my head and told her we'd talk about it later. I needed time to figure out what the hell I was going to do. Later that night, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, I confronted my dad privately. I thought maybe he'd explain that it was just a formality or that I'd still be heavily involved, something to justify this insane decision. But nope. He doubled down. He told me he believed Mike was the right choice because he was young, full of fresh ideas, and had a degree. A freaking degree. Meanwhile, I'd been the one actually building relationships with clients, managing the team, and handling day-to-day operations for over a decade. He even had the audacity to say, "You can still work with him, mentor him, show him the ropes." That was it for me. I told him right then and there that I couldn't stay. There was no way I'd work under Mike after everything I'd done for the company. It wasn't even about the money or the title at that point. It was the principle. I'd earned that position. I deserved it. And being told I wasn't even considered was like a slap in the face. The next couple of days were a blur. My parents tried to talk me out of quitting, saying I was being dramatic, that I needed to think about the family. But I couldn't see it any other way. If they didn't value my work enough to give me the role I'd been working towards, then I didn't see the point in staying. So I handed in my resignation, packed up my office, and walked away. Walking out of that office for the last time was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I'd spent so many years there. I knew every inch of that place, the good parts and the bad. It wasn't just a job to me, it was a part of my life. Leaving felt like cutting off a limb, but I knew I had to. Staying would have been even worse. My wife was incredibly supportive through all of this. She told me she respected my decision and that she was proud of me for standing up for myself. She saw how much this hurt me, but she also knew I couldn't stay in a situation where I wasn't respected. That support meant the world to me because honestly, it felt like the rest of my family was against me. My mom kept calling, begging me to reconsider. My dad even showed up at my house unannounced one day, trying to convince me to come back. But every time they asked, my answer was the same: no. The hardest part of all this was the feeling of betrayal. My dad and I used to be close, especially when we first started the company. I gave up my own career to help him build his dream. And now, it felt like he was throwing me away. And for what? Some idea that Mike was the future just because he had a degree? It didn't make sense. After I left, I didn't hear from Mike directly. I don't even know if he wanted the position or if he just went along with it because my parents insisted. Either way, it didn't matter. The damage was done. My parents had made their choice. and now I had to make mine. The first few weeks after quitting were tough. I kept replaying the conversation with my dad in my head, wondering if there was something I could have said or done differently. But every time, I came to the same conclusion. I made the right call. There was no way I could have stayed and watched Mike fumble his way through running the company while I stood on the sidelines, biting my tongue. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about my self-respect. So here I am now, 6 months later, still trying to piece my life back together. I've been keeping my distance from my family, focusing on figuring out my next steps. And as much as it hurts to say this, I think walking away was the best thing I could have done. If they couldn't see my worth, then I had no reason to stick around. After I quit, I thought I'd wash my hands of the family business for good. I didn't want to think about it, hear about it, or even be reminded it existed. But life doesn't work like that, especially when the thing you're trying to forget is tied to your family. Despite my best efforts, news about the company and Mike's disastrous leadership kept finding its way to me. At first, it was little things. A friend of mine who still worked there texted me saying, "Dude, Mike just fired 3 senior employees because they didn't vibe with his vision." My first reaction? I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. Mike had no clue what he was doing. And my parents, they were about to learn that the hard way. Next, I heard he was making some bold changes to our contracts. I'm all for innovation, but Mike was messing with deals that had been in place for years, relationships I had carefully built and nurtured. Clients started walking away, frustrated and confused. And still, my parents stuck by him. "He's just adjusting," my mom told a mutual friend. "It's all part of the process." Yeah, sure, the process of tanking a company. Then came the real kicker, financial fraud. I don't know all the specifics because honestly, I don't care to dig into the details. But from what I gathered, Mike tried to inflate our numbers to impress a big client. Rookie mistake. The guy probably thought he was being clever, but all he did was wave a giant red flag that screamed, "Audit me." The fallout was immediate and brutal. The company's reputation was shredded, clients bailed en masse, and the lawsuits started piling up. Hearing about all this was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. On one hand, I felt vindicated. I mean, I'd warned my parents that Mike wasn't ready for the job, but they didn't listen. On the other hand, it was painful to see something I'd worked so hard to build crumble in such a short amount of time. I didn't want to care, but I couldn't help it. That company had been my life for 12 years. It was like watching someone take a sledgehammer to a house you built with your own 2 hands. But here's the thing. None of this surprised me. Mike was never prepared to lead. The guy grew up with a silver spoon in his mouth, never had to struggle for anything. He had this arrogance about him, like he thought he could just walk into a room and figure things out as he went. That might work in school, but not in the real world. Business isn't forgiving. It doesn't care about your last name or your GPA. And Mike was learning that the hard way. I wasn't the only one who saw it coming. I started getting calls and texts from former coworkers, people I hadn't spoken to in months. "Man, we miss you around here," one guy said. "It's a mess without you," another told me. "The place feels like a sinking ship. I don't know how much longer I can stick around." It was flattering, sure, but also bittersweet. These were people I'd worked alongside for years, people who had trusted me and supported me. Hearing them struggle made me wish I could help, but I knew better than to get involved. I wasn't about to swoop in and clean up Mike's mess. That wasn't my job anymore. What really got me, though, was how my parents handled all of this. Instead of holding Mike accountable, they made excuses for him. "He's under a lot of pressure," my mom said when someone asked about the fraud charges. "He just needs time to find his footing." Time. The guy had managed to nearly destroy the company in less than 6 months. How much more time did he need? And let's not forget my sister. She was Mike's biggest cheerleader through all of this, acting like he was some kind of misunderstood genius. I didn't know if she was genuinely delusional or just too proud to admit she'd made a mistake. Either way, it was infuriating. She'd pushed for Mike to get the CEO role, convinced my parents it was the right move, and now she was doubling down on her bad decision. I stayed out of it for the most part. But one day, I couldn't resist. I ran into an old family friend at the grocery store, and they casually mentioned how exciting it must be to see the next generation taking over the business. I just smiled and said, "Exciting isn't the word I'd use." They laughed, but I wasn't joking. In a weird way, watching the company implode was cathartic. It was like all the frustration and anger I'd felt when they passed me over for Mike was being validated. I wasn't crazy, I wasn't overreacting. They'd made a huge mistake, and now they were paying the price. That said, I didn't revel in their failure. I'd moved on, or at least I was trying to. I'd started brainstorming ideas for my own business, something I could build from the ground up without anyone else's interference. My wife was incredibly supportive, encouraging me to take the leap and do something for myself. It was scary, but also exciting. For the first time in years, I felt like I had control over my own future. Meanwhile, my parents were scrambling. I heard through mutual acquaintances that they were trying to contain the damage and restore trust with clients. Good luck with that. Once trust is broken, it's nearly impossible to get it back, especially in the business world. And with lawsuits piling up, they had bigger problems to deal with. As for Mike, I had no idea how he was handling everything. I hadn't spoken to him since I quit, and honestly, I didn't care to. But from what I heard, he was in over his head. Some people said he was still trying to act like he had it all under control, while others claimed he was on the verge of a breakdown. Either way, it wasn't my problem. By the time 6 months had passed, the company was a shadow of what it had been. Clients were gone, employees were leaving in droves, and my parents were desperate. They hadn't reached out to me yet, but I knew it was only a matter of time. And when they did, I already knew what I was going to say. 6 months after I walked out of the family business, the inevitable happened. I'd been bracing myself for it, but I still felt a wave of mixed emotions when I saw my parents standing on my doorstep. They looked older, more stressed than I'd ever seen them. My dad had this awkward stiffness to him, like he didn't want to be there but knew he had no choice. My mom, though, her expression said it all. Desperation. I didn't invite them in right away. Honestly, I was tempted to shut the door in their faces, but I didn't. "Can we come in?" my dad asked, his voice hesitant. I stepped aside without a word, and they shuffled in. The tension in the room was immediate. My wife, who'd been in the kitchen, gave me a look but didn't say anything. She knew this moment was coming too. She quietly slipped upstairs, leaving me to deal with it. I sat down across from them, arms crossed, waiting for them to start. My mom jumped in first. She always did. "We need your help," she said, her voice wavering. "The business is..." She hesitated, like saying it out loud would make it worse. "It's in trouble. Mike made some mistakes. Big ones." I didn't respond. I just stared at her, letting the silence stretch. It was clear she wanted me to fill the gap, to jump in and offer a solution. I didn't. Eventually, my dad spoke up. "He's in over his head," he admitted, rubbing his temple like he had a headache. "And now the company is facing lawsuits, losing clients. We're barely hanging on." This was a moment I'd thought about many times since I quit. I'd imagined them coming to me, asking me to fix things, and me laughing in their faces. But now that it was actually happening, I felt more annoyed than anything else. It wasn't satisfying or validating. It was just sad. "And what do you expect me to do about it?" I finally asked. My tone wasn't angry, but it wasn't kind either. I wanted them to squirm a little. They deserved it. My mom reached out, putting her hand on mine. "You know the business better than anyone," she said. "We need you to come back, please." Her words hit me harder than I expected. For years, all I wanted was for them to recognize my value, to admit I was the one keeping the company afloat. And now, here they were, practically begging me to save them. But it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like an insult. "Why don't you ask Mike?" I said, pulling my hand away. "He's the CEO, right? Let him fix it." "Mike can't handle it," my dad said, frustration creeping into his voice. "We made a mistake. We see that now. But this is bigger than him. It's about the company, about everything we've built." "Everything I've built," I corrected. "I'm the one who spent 12 years making that company what it is, and you threw me aside like I was nothing." My dad sighed heavily, leaning back in his chair. He looked tired, defeated. "We thought we were doing the right thing," he said. "We thought Mike would bring something new to the table. But you were right. He wasn't ready. And now we're paying the price." Hearing him admit that should have felt good, but it didn't. It just made me angrier. They'd known Mike wasn't ready. I'd told them over and over, but they hadn't listened. And now they wanted me to pick up the pieces. "I'm sorry," my mom said softly, tears welling up in her eyes. "We were wrong. We should have trusted you. But it's not too late. You can still fix this." I stood up, pacing the room. "You want me to fix it?" I said, my voice rising. "You think I can just walk back in there and magically make everything better? Do you even hear yourselves? You didn't trust me before, but now that you're desperate, I'm suddenly good enough?" They didn't say anything, and the silence only fueled my anger. "Do you even understand what you're asking? You're asking me to put my life on hold again, to bail you out of a situation you created, and for what? So you can pat me on the back and tell me, 'Good job, kid,' before throwing me under the bus again?" "That's not what this is," my dad said firmly. "This is about saving the company, saving our legacy." "Your legacy," I shot back. "Not mine. Not anymore." My mom started crying then, full-on sobbing into her hands. My dad just sat there, staring at the floor like he didn't know what to do. And for a moment, I felt bad. They were my parents, after all. But then I remembered the humiliation, the betrayal, the countless nights I'd spent working late while they were off praising Mike for his good grades. That angered me more than their tears could ever soften. "I can't help you," I said finally, my voice steady. "I won't. I've already started working on my own plans. I'm building something for myself now, and I'm not going to throw that away to clean up your mess." My dad looked up, his face hardening. "So that's it? You're just going to turn your back on your family?" I laughed, a bitter sound. "You turned your back on me first. Don't try to guilt me into this. It won't work." They left soon after that. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about what they'd said. A part of me wanted to fix things, but another part of me knew it wasn't my responsibility anymore. They made their choice, and now they had to live with it. I fell asleep that night, feeling more certain than ever. I wasn't going back. It was time to move forward. After my parents showed up at my doorstep, I felt a strange sense of clarity for the first time in months. I stopped looking back. I'd spent too much time stewing over what happened, rehashing the betrayal, the disappointment, the anger. But after slamming that door on them, metaphorically and literally, I realized it was time to focus on what lay ahead. If I wasn't going back to their company, I needed to build something of my own. Starting from scratch is daunting, even when you know what you're doing. I didn't have a big office or a fancy team. Hell, I didn't even have a proper plan at first. All I had were the skills and knowledge I'd built over 12 years and the determination to prove to myself, and maybe a little to them, that I could do this. The first step was figuring out what kind of business I wanted to create. Real estate was all I knew, so that part was a no-brainer. But I didn't just want to recreate my dad's company. I wanted to do something different, something better. I'd learned a lot over the years, not just about the market, but about how to treat people, clients, employees, everyone. My parents had always treated the business like a machine, churning out deals without much regard for the people behind them. I wanted to build something more personal, more human. I started by reaching out to a few of my old clients, people I'd worked with for years, people who trusted me. I explained that I was starting my own thing and asked if they'd be interested in working with me again. To my surprise and relief, most of them were enthusiastic. "We were wondering when you'd get back in the game," one of them said. "Mike's been a disaster. We've been waiting for someone to step up." Their responses gave me the boost of confidence I needed. If they believed in me, maybe I could pull this off after all. But getting clients on board was just one piece of the puzzle. I also needed a team. The company wasn't going to run itself. That's where my old coworkers came in. I'd kept in touch with a few of them after I left, and I knew some were unhappy with how things had been going under Mike's leadership. One by one, I started making calls. "Hey, I'm putting something together," I told them. "It's small right now, but I think it has potential. Are you interested?" The responses were overwhelmingly positive. Many of them had already left my dad's company, tired of the chaos and mismanagement. They were between jobs, looking for something new. "I'm in," one of them said immediately. "I've been waiting for this call." Within a couple of weeks, I had a small but solid team. We didn't have a fancy office or shiny equipment, just a shared workspace and a lot of enthusiasm. It felt like the early days of my dad's company, when we were scrappy and hungry. Except this time it was my vision, my rules. Setting up the business was a whirlwind. Between registering the company, building a website, and figuring out how to market ourselves, I barely had time to breathe. But it was exhilarating. Every small win, a client signing on, a lead turning into a deal, felt like a massive accomplishment. For the first time in years, I wasn't just working, I was creating something, and it felt incredible. Of course, it wasn't all smooth sailing. There were moments of doubt, moments where I questioned whether I was biting off more than I could chew. The stress of juggling everything, finances, logistics, client relationships, was overwhelming at times. But every time I felt like giving up, I reminded myself why I was doing this. I wasn't just building a business, I was proving to myself that I could. One of the biggest challenges was balancing work and personal life. My wife was incredibly supportive, but I knew it wasn't easy for her. She was working full-time while I poured all my energy into the business, often working late into the night. "You're going to burn out if you keep this up," she warned me one night as I sat hunched over my laptop, reviewing contracts. "I know," I said, rubbing my temples. "But if I don't push now, it'll never take off." She didn't argue, but I could see the concern in her eyes. It was a reminder that while building the business was important, so was maintaining the life we'd built together. I made a mental note to find a better balance, though I wasn't sure how just yet. As the weeks went by, things started to fall into place. Our first few deals closed smoothly, and the feedback from clients was overwhelmingly positive. "This feels like the old days," one of them told me. "When things were simpler, more personal. I missed this." Hearing that felt like validation. I was doing something right. The business began to grow. It wasn't explosive growth by any means, but it was steady, and that was enough for me. Meanwhile, I couldn't ignore the rumblings about my dad's company. Word on the street was that things were going from bad to worse. They were losing clients left and right, and the lawsuits were piling up. It was hard not to feel a twinge of satisfaction. After all, I'd warned them. But mostly, I just felt sorry for the employees and clients who were caught in the crossfire. They deserved better. What really surprised me was how many of those clients and employees started coming to me. It wasn't something I actively pursued, at least not at first. But word got around that I was starting my own thing, and people reached out. "If you're looking for more staff, let me know," one former coworker said. "I can't stand it here anymore." Another client emailed me, saying, "We've always trusted you. Let's talk." I wasn't poaching. They were coming to me, and honestly, it felt good. These were people who recognized my value, who wanted to work with me because of what I brought to the table. It was a stark contrast to how my family had treated me. By the end of the second month, we'd outgrown our shared workspace and started looking for a proper office. It was a small milestone, but it felt huge. Standing in that empty space, imagining the possibilities, I couldn't help but smile. This was mine, all of it. No one could take it away from me. I wasn't just surviving, I was thriving. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly free. By the time I'd settled into the rhythm of my new business, things with my family had escalated. Word had spread about what I was doing, clients switching to me, employees reaching out to join my team, and it didn't take long for the news to reach my parents and sister. I hadn't spoken to any of them since their visit to my house, and I wasn't planning to, but they clearly weren't done with me. It started with emails. My dad sent a few, all variations of the same message. He wanted to talk, to work things out. I ignored them. Then my mom started calling. At first it was once a week, then every few days. I never picked up. Eventually, she left a voicemail that made my blood boil. "I hope you're happy," she said, her voice trembling with barely concealed anger. "You're tearing this family apart. I don't know how you can live with yourself." I deleted the message without replying. What was there to say? They'd made their bed, and now they had to lie in it. I wasn't responsible for their mess, no matter how much they tried to pin it on me. But things really came to a head when my sister got involved. Unlike my parents, who were still trying to guilt me into coming back, she went straight for the jugular. One day, out of nowhere, I received a letter from a lawyer. At first, I thought it was a mistake, but as I read through it, my stomach sank. They were accusing me of stealing clients and employees. According to the letter, I'd intentionally undermined their business by poaching key accounts and personnel. They claimed I was violating some sort of unwritten family agreement and demanded I cease all operations immediately. If I didn't, they threatened to take legal action. I couldn't help but laugh as I read it. It was so ridiculous, so petty. There was no non-compete clause in my contract when I worked for them. I'd checked twice. They had no legal standing whatsoever. But the fact that they'd resorted to this tactic told me everything I needed to know about how desperate they were. Instead of responding directly, I forwarded the letter to my lawyer. "Handle it," I told him. "I don't have time for this nonsense." He assured me it was an empty threat and not to worry. Still, the whole thing left a bad taste in my mouth. A few days later, my parents showed up at my office unannounced. It was the first time they'd seen the new space, and I could tell they weren't happy about it. My mom looked around with thinly veiled disdain, while my dad's expression was a mix of anger and defeat. "Do you really think this is going to work?" my dad asked, gesturing at the office. "You're playing a dangerous game." I leaned back in my chair, unfazed. "It's already working," I said simply. "And it's not a game." My mom's face flushed with anger. "You're ruining everything," she snapped. "Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family, to us?" I stood up, keeping my voice calm but firm. "What I'm doing," I said, "is building something for myself, something you didn't think I was capable of. If that bothers you, that's your problem, not mine." They didn't stay long after that. I think they realized there was no point in trying to guilt me anymore. But their visit left me shaken. Not because of what they said, but because it confirmed something I'd suspected for a while. They weren't just upset about losing the business. They were upset about losing control over me. For years, I'd been the dependable one, the one they could count on to keep things running smoothly. I'd sacrificed so much of my own life to help build their dream, and now that I was gone, they didn't know what to do. It wasn't about the clients or the money, it was about the power dynamic, and they hated that I'd taken it back. Meanwhile, things at my dad's company were going from bad to worse. Employees were quitting in droves, and their reputation was in tatters. Mike, I heard, was barely showing up to work anymore. Someone told me he'd been spotted at a bar in the middle of the day, looking completely out of it. I didn't feel sorry for him, but I couldn't help but think about how all of this might have been avoided if my parents had made a different choice. The lawsuits were still ongoing, and from what little I knew, the company's legal team was struggling to keep up. I didn't envy them. Trying to clean up the mess Mike had made was like trying to put out a forest fire with a garden hose. It was only a matter of time before the whole thing came crashing down. Through it all, I kept my focus on my own business. We were growing steadily, bringing in new clients and expanding our team. I hired a small marketing firm to help us get the word out, and it paid off almost immediately. The inquiries started pouring in, and for the first time in a long time, I felt optimistic about the future. One night, as I was reviewing our financials, my wife came into the room with a glass of ginger ale. "You know," she said, sitting down next to me, "I don't think I've ever seen you this happy." I smiled, setting the papers aside. "It feels good," I admitted. "Building something for myself, not answering to anyone else." She leaned her head on my shoulder. "You deserve it." Her words stayed with me long after she went to bed. For so long, I'd been chasing someone else's approval. My parents, my family, even Mike in a way. But now, I was finally doing something for myself, and for the first time, I didn't care what anyone else thought. As I sat there, surrounded by the evidence of my hard work, I realized something important. This wasn't just about proving my parents wrong or outshining Mike. It was about proving to myself that I was capable of more. that I didn't need their validation to succeed. And in that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice. Let them send their letters. Let them make their threats. I wasn't going back. Not now. Not ever. Months after my parents' unannounced visit to my office and the laughable legal threats from my sister, I found myself in a place I hadn't expected: contentment. My new business was running well. Not perfectly, of course, but enough to keep me busy and optimistic. My wife had even started talking about scaling down her own job to join me full-time, and the thought of building this together made it all feel even more meaningful. Still, the remnants of my old life lingered in the background. My parents weren't the kind to just let things go, and though I had blocked most of their attempts to contact me, every now and then, word about the family business or Mike would filter through mutual acquaintances. And the news was rarely good. Mike, it seemed, had finally cracked under the pressure. The lawsuits had drained the company financially, and the loss of key clients meant their revenue was practically non-existent. My dad was forced to liquidate some assets to keep the doors open, but even that wasn't enough. A couple of former coworkers who had joined me recently mentioned that the office was practically a ghost town. Employees who stayed were doing so out of desperation, not loyalty. One day, I got a call from an old client who'd stuck with my dad's company longer than most. "Your parents sold the building," he said. "I thought you'd want to know." That caught me off guard. Selling the office? That building had been the company's home since day one. It was more than just a workspace. It was a symbol of everything we'd built together. Hearing that it was gone felt strange. Not sad exactly, but like another piece of the past had crumbled away. "Thanks for letting me know," I told him, "but I'm not involved with them anymore." "I figured as much," he said. "Just thought you'd want to hear it from someone who's still rooting for you." I appreciated that. It reminded me that not everyone had turned their back on me during this mess. A few weeks after that, I got another surprise. This time, it wasn't a phone call or a letter. It was an email from my dad. I almost deleted it without reading, but curiosity got the better of me. The subject line read, "An apology." I opened it, skimming the first few lines, expecting more excuses or pleas for help. But as I read further, I realized it was different this time. He wasn't asking me to come back or trying to shift the blame. He was admitting he'd made a mistake. "I thought I was doing what was best for the family," he wrote, "but I see now that I let my pride get in the way. I listened to your sister because I didn't want to admit I was wrong about Mike. I see now that you were the one who deserved that position, and I'm sorry for not recognizing it sooner." The email went on for several paragraphs, recounting moments from the past that I'd long since buried. He talked about how much he'd relied on me during the early years, how he knew the company wouldn't have survived without my contributions. Reading it felt surreal. Part of me had waited years to hear these words, but now that they were here, I didn't know how to feel. Toward the end, he mentioned something that stuck with me. "I know I can't fix what's happened," he wrote, "but I hope someday you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." I closed the email without replying. Forgiveness was a complicated thing. I wasn't angry anymore, not really, but I wasn't ready to let them back into my life either. It felt like they were still trying to pull me into the past, and I'd worked too hard to leave that behind. Meanwhile, my business continued to grow. We moved into a larger office space and brought on a few more employees. Some of the clients who'd stayed loyal to my dad's company eventually reached out, asking if they could work with me instead. I was hesitant at first, but after a few conversations, I realized they weren't just looking for a deal, they were looking for stability. I gave them that, and in return, they gave me their trust. As for Mike, the last I heard, he was living with my sister again. The lawsuits had been settled, but the financial damage was done. He was reportedly trying to find himself, though what that actually meant was anyone's guess. I didn't wish him ill, but I also didn't feel sorry for him. He'd been handed an opportunity he wasn't ready for, and he'd squandered it. That wasn't my problem. My sister, predictably, wasn't handling the fallout well. From what little I heard through mutual acquaintances, she was bitter and angry, blaming everyone but herself for how things turned out. My parents had stopped defending her publicly, which told me everything I needed to know. They were finally seeing her for who she really was. Not the brilliant daughter they'd always believed in, but someone who was good at looking out for herself and no one else. One day, while sitting in my office and looking out at the city skyline, I realized I felt free. Truly free. The weight of my family's expectations, their disappointment, their manipulation, it was all gone. For so long, I had defined myself by what they thought of me, by what I could do to earn their approval. But now, none of that mattered. I wasn't building my business to prove a point or to spite them. I was doing it for myself, for my wife, for the people who believed in me. And that was enough. I don't know if I'll ever fully reconcile with my family. Maybe someday when the dust is truly settled, we'll find a way to mend the broken pieces. Or maybe we won't. Either way, I'm okay with it. For now, I'm focused on the future. And for the first time in years, it feels like mine.